now. So thanks for coming last week, this is the first field session, and then this week's the second one. So kicking off, we've got Scott and Ben. They're going to be talking about the Observer Ideas Festival and what they kind of learnt from it and sort of cool things they saw. So I'll hand over to the guys and then any questions at the end.
Hello, I'm Scott. This is Ben. Today, 5.5 things we learned at the Observer Festival Ideas, including musings on life, liberty and technology. So the first thing that we wanted to do was apologise for calling it this terrible name that we never actually thought would see the light of day, but due to Kate being a very, very good promoter, we've seen this everywhere. So first of all, sorry for calling it a wanky name, and also sorry if you've turned up thinking we're going to talk about that, because what you're actually going to see is 5.5 things that were sort of interesting. But if you have come for musings on technology and liberty, feel free to just read these for the rest of the presentation. So what we've done is get quotes from people musing on technology and liberty that are far more qualified to do it than Ben and I are. And we'll just get on with the rest of the presentation and you can just sort of read those. So glad we've kind of got that underway. Laura did something. We just went to a conference and she made some cool stuff and sold some cool stuff, and that was really impressive. We were both here last week. Just to set your expectations, the most impressive thing that Ben and I did for this was we both had to get up really early on a Sunday and get ourselves into London. That's about as kind of impressive as our kind of involvement was. But what we're going to try and do in the next few minutes is just pull out some of the things that we thought were kind of interesting and kind of caught our eye. So over to you, Ben.
So this is like a selection of some of the people that were speaking. So I'm sure you don't actually recognise a lot of these people, neither did Scott and I, but there's kind of range of people. So on the left, that guy's a musician who plays the piano, quite well actually as it happens. And then we've got like David Simon up there, who is the writer of The Wire, Jack Monroe, who's the sort of political activist, kind of cook girl. We've got Tiny Temper, who I was obviously, that was a big deal about him turning up, and then a few other guys here. And the sort of format was that they came on stage and would talk for sort of 15 to 20 minutes about something that they were kind of passionate about or what they were interested about. And I think for both of us, what was great is it was probably quite refreshingly free of a lot of the buzzwords that sometimes get floated around, specifically in our industry. So there was no one with an Oculus Rift there trying to get you to talk about that. No one wanted you to hack anything. No one was trying to gamify. There was no native advertising. Nothing was coming out of a printer that looked like something. No one was putting the internet into something, and no one was wearing those little bands. So it's kind of sometimes nice to realise that there's a world outside of all of that that perhaps we aren't sort of as we don't talk about or aware of. Sometimes in our industry. So I'm going to talk about the 5.5 people that we thought were interesting and their kind of ideas. So don't mistake any of these ideas for anything that Scott and I have come up with off our own bat. It's these guys' kind of ideas. So firstly, I don't know how many people know of Yevgeny Morozov, but I'd thoroughly recommend any of you guys checking out some of the stuff that he's writing about, specifically in his book here, but he's kind of quite widely published across the internet. And what Mr. Morozov, I'll call him, is particularly interested in, he's quite kind of wary of what's happening with technology companies and the amount of data that's being collected and the way our lives are being tracked, which I think is really interesting. He's got a really interesting point of view that he feels like we're increasingly looking at kind of causation as to why things happen. So we're looking at wearable tech and we're looking at kind of how many steps you do in a day and go, well, I need to do more steps or I need to kind of do this. And I think he's what he's questioning is that, you know, whether we're not looking at the reason why these things happen. So why aren't I taking enough steps in the day? Why is there, you know, why is this happening? Rather than, so just looking at the data kind of output isn't enough. We need to question the causation of these things and not just look at the kind of correlation, which I think is really fascinating. He made a great point that increasingly everything's being kind of pushed onto individuals with the sort of personalisation of stuff. So we're tracking all our data, but we're not so when we get all this real-time data about ourselves, but do we get much real-time data from governments, from banks, from energy companies? And I think that's a really interesting concept for us to think about, how that's sort of relevant to what we do.
So next up was David Simon, who created The Wire, and he talked a lot about how The Wire was created to expose a lot of the kind of political and social issues that were happening in America. And he talked a little bit about that, but he also talked a lot about how, especially in America, but it's also kind of true of this country, the sort of political system and people's faith in government is sort of ground to a halt because people have such entrenched views on the way the world works that no one's willing to kind of concede and work together and try and find compromise solutions so that society actually moves forward. He was talking about how America's kind of hit a kind of political crisis and deadlock. And he also had this quote which he said that the biggest plague of modern political discourse is people who believe they have the paragraph in an answer. Sorry, the answer in a paragraph. And again, it was really fascinating to hear this sort of spoken about in the political sphere. You know, I'm a conservative and therefore the world works like this, and the way to solve every problem is to see it through a conservative lens or a liberal lens or a free market lens or a libertarian lens. And actually the more we thought about it, Ben and I were kind of batting this around afterwards, it's not so true of our industry, but again, that I think it made us reflect on how wary we need to be as individuals, companies, agencies, just in terms of how a lot of the discourse out there is driven by people who believe that there is just one way of looking at the world and there's just one thing that is important, whether it be some of the jargony words that we heard earlier or otherwise. So what was quite refreshing on the day was being able to sort of hear someone very impressive talk and then try and kind of relate it back to sort of what we were doing.
And so one of the kind of big speakers was, I hope everyone recognises this guy. So this is Edward Snowden on a live link up from kind of Russia, talking about what he's doing in his in Moscow, hiding out from the American government. And it's firstly quite interesting the way that he would only use Skype. They asked him whether he'd do a Google Hangout or anything like this, and he doesn't trust Google enough to want to do that, which is quite interesting. So he was only willing to do this kind of via Skype, and it was all crackly and actually went down occasionally, which made you wonder whether someone was trying to hack into it. I don't know. But what's, again, and this is, you know, a kind of data point, what's interesting about Edward Snowden, his kind of critiques of the amount of the way in which kind of governments are increasingly looking at our kind of data and sort of using that for surveillance and asking the question of, you know, putting it more towards government, saying you need to prove to us why you need this data rather than we prove to you why you don't need it, which I think is quite interesting. And he's you know, obviously he's been his whole life has changed because he believes in this. And I think it's going to be interesting to see if there's this kind of movement towards people kind of being more protective of their data, being more aware of what they're putting out there in the kind of public space. And I think beyond sort of tweets and Facebook and all that kind of stuff, but the actual, you know, your phone call data, your location data, all of that, about how if we become more conscious of that, how that's going to, one, affect our behaviours, but two, kind of if that's going to change any kind of public mood or sentiment within us, and how we kind of expect governments to behave with that data. So I think for me, that's an interesting trend to see if that takes off, or whether it just becomes a kind of liberal guardian agenda point of, right, we've got to look after our data. So how and when that kind of goes mainstream as a behaviour, or if people are willing to trade all of their data for kind of free goods and services that we get now, I think is really, really interesting to look at over the next few years.
Next one, does anyone know Edwin Collins? He was the front man of a band very popular in the 80s.
We also did Never Met a Girl Like You Before.
Never Met a Girl Like You Before, that was his famous track. We often talk about inspiration and needing to find sources of inspiration for clients and cool stuff we've seen elsewhere. This was the most inspiring thing I've seen in years, just on a really human level. He had a stroke 9 years ago, and over the course of the last 9 years, so he lost all sensation in half of his body. And over the course of 9 years, he taught himself how to walk, how to talk, and then how to sing again. And there's a documentary film that's just been made where they've been following him for the last 5 years. It's called The Possibilities Are Endless. And if you do one thing after this talk, go and watch that documentary. But he came on stage, he gave a bit of an interview, and his wife came on stage, and they were talking about how notions of identity and life have kind of changed off the back of having the stroke and recovering from it. And then he performed live on stage, and it was sort of devastating, really. It was just so powerful that half the audience were crying. It was really bizarre. But go and see that documentary. It's out. I think it's out now, isn't it?
But we've seen it, Scott, haven't we? So,
yeah.
And then I think it's kind of interesting to look at this from the perspective, okay, well, what do you learn from the Observer about them putting on these kind of events? And I think the way that the Guardian and this is the sort of Sunday title of the Observer are increasingly moving into these events and putting on different workshops with their writers and all this kind of stuff, and they've got a new event space opposite their offices, which I think is opening next year, kind of thinking about how a print title, which is obviously having a diminished sort of circulation and isn't being able to make the money back in its kind of digital revenues, what they're doing to try and make a difference. And I think looking at the way they're doing these kind of events and getting the speakers and building up their brand and building themselves a brand around putting on these kind of events is really interesting. And to see, and I don't see, there aren't any other kind of broadsheet papers like the Times or the Telegraph who've moved quite as aggressively into this kind of space and tried to align their brand in this kind of way. So I think looking at newspapers and seeing what they do to become more than a kind of print paper or more than a website that delivers news is interesting. And so I think again that's another thing to watch and see what newspapers will do to kind of shift our perceptions of them and move them beyond simply being a place that we kind of find news to a place that's again kind of focused on inspiration and connecting us with interesting people that we might not necessarily get to meet or hear from usually. And then lastly, so what we learned from Tiny. So I'll be brutally honest, I don't think we learned an awful lot from Tiny. So we learned that Tiny, like when he's kind of off work, he likes to wear quite what I assume is expensive knitwear onto stage. Tiny doesn't do PowerPoint, which is kind of interesting because I would have quite liked it if he came up with slides, because you can kind of imagine him on his, probably an Apple Mac, isn't it? Like doing some slides and saying I like anime, and all that sort of stuff. So Tiny Temper came up without slides and actually seemed like he wasn't particularly kind of well rehearsed, which I found disappointing. And then he started to muse on that he'd found in his life that money was less important than spending time with your family. which I kind of think, Tiny, no shit. You've got, if it's taken you, so he was like, so I think, I can't remember how old he is, but it's like, I finally realised that, you know, all this money, and then he would kind of go on about his wealth, and it's like, oh, okay, you know, all the whatever houses that I've got, you know, what's more important is spending time with your family. So it's like, I would say, thanks Tiny for the utterly banal observation, but yeah, maybe next time be a little bit prepared, and maybe bring some slides as well.
So the sort of interesting things were causation is not correlation. Just being wary of people who are carrying paragraph answers with themselves. Made us both question, like, who owns our data and are we cool with that, and should there be change in the systems and kind of assumptions around what you are and aren't entitled to in terms of data. Go and watch that documentary because it's amazing. And then it's just interesting the shift from thinking of us as readers to thinking of us as owners. And yeah, that's right. If you want to know how we've managed to get those quotes scrolling through, that took longer to do than the rest of the presentation. But yeah, anyway, thank you for putting up with us.